Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on well-being in the time of COVID. My name is Richard Park. I'm a member of the Committee for IOSH's Health and Social Care Group, which has recently conducted a survey of members and identified certain topics which were of interest, so this webinar is partly in response to that. This will be a practical session on the management of well-being when staff are returning to work, and training and tools which can support staff in their well-being. So as we're all aware, the scale and the scope of the problems caused by COVID-19 this year have touched every part of every life, and all workplaces have their challenges, but perhaps none more so than the health and social care sector. And it's entirely due to the tireless support, the commitment and the dedication of staff that sector has continued to provide care for those who need it most. But this has brought some change with it. So joining me to discuss some of the issues that are arising from that this morning are Susan Gimson and Louise Stewart from Public Health Scotland, which supports the health and work agenda and also now economic recovery through a variety of services under the brand of Healthy Working Lives. We'll also be hearing from Jason Fevers, whose background is in public health and behaviour change, having previously developed wellbeing programmes for local authority, and he currently works for Cancer Research UK on policy level interventions on cancer prevention and early diagnosis. Jason also works part-time delivering training in mental health awareness, mental health first aid and behavioural change. So that will key in nicely to this morning's topics. So I'm just going to hand over now to Susan and Louise and let them carry on the first part of this morning's presentation.
Thanks, Richard. As Richard said, myself and Louise are going to be talking in this first section around well-being in a time of COVID-19, and perhaps I would say our section relates more to the actual reality of the workplace specifically, and Jason will then follow on talking more about well-being as a whole. So hopefully between those two bits we'll cover most of what you're looking for. To start with, I think it's just to set the scene. We don't have a lot of time. I would first of all say if we don't cover something in the questions, we have got a website, healthyworkinglives.scot, so feel free to have a look there where there's a lot more information, but hopefully we'll touch on a range of issues to get you thinking. In terms of ongoing issues and return to work just now, in the situation with COVID, I think it's important to consider that, as we can see from the news, COVID isn't disappearing, and if you're trying to maintain your business at any time, in relation to well-being, you could have the situation where you have staff who themselves are not at work because they're experiencing COVID themselves. They might be not attending work because they are caring for other people who have the symptoms, or perhaps they're having to work from home and that doesn't work well with the work that you're asking them to do, so they're not in work. You could also have people who, even though things are easing, aren't able to work as you would have wished because of childcare and responsibilities. And you may also have people who are coming back to work post-COVID, and what we're starting to see now is far more people who are seeing the longer term effects of having had COVID in terms of lung function or whatever. And obviously that has a combined effect with people who have existing health conditions. So there's the comorbidity issues to consider in the workplace, that you may be having a far greater demand on occupational health or seeking support for those people. So just something I thought, well, let's consider all of those situations, and at the same time in your workplace you're trying to keep things moving forward. COVID risk assessments, I have just put that up there. Obviously, if you've got people back working with you, or people are working remotely and you're considering getting them back in, or you're trying to run the business with them externally, then you will have been doing, I would imagine, COVID risk assessments. It's an IOSH thing. I know you'll be all over it. But one of the things that I thought it is important to consider is well-being. And as Jason will talk about well-being, but I think just to put that placer there to say it's not as simple as just bringing people back to work or getting people working. A lot of people who have underlying anxiety, this is brought to the forefront again, and perhaps staff will need additional support or different controls. And so this is where we have really been encouraging people to also consider individual risk assessments. It allows you to build on the general risk assessments that you may have done for COVID, that you may be doing for COVID. Individual risk assessments are essentially similar to any risk assessment or even a stress risk assessment for individuals, where you're trying to unpick what actually are the issues that are impacting on them. And that's why you wouldn't want to do it for everybody if everybody is fine. But as you find people that may be struggling, we would really say that considering individual risk assessments, particularly in relation to unpicking the things that are harder to identify, you maybe need to have conversations, and that's where having great managers who really know their staff makes all the difference. Additionally, well-being in COVID, I think there are additional tools that the Scottish Government in particular have brought out that build on those individual risk assessments. I don't know if anybody's seen or used the COVID age tool that the Scottish Government have put forward, and that really takes research that has been done by Alama, who, and again we'll give you the links, they're all on our websites and Scottish Government websites, but I don't know if any of you have used it, but it is a risk assessment which reviews people's COVID age, which is actually quite interesting, and what it does is it looks at pre-existing conditions people might have, and that helps to identify whether they have additional risks, which in turn links into their individual risk assessments. So really just touching on those range of tools that are there, but also things to consider now people are back at work or are coming back to work. Essentially, we use this in health and safety. We love an iceberg. So in terms of occupational health and wider COVID and mental health and well-being, these icebergs work great for everyone. Essentially, there's a group of people always in your workplace who will be thriving at work. But for the small group that are thriving, there will be a large proportion who are struggling, and that may be as a result of health conditions, home conditions, issues going on. And this always was the case way before COVID, but COVID has brought a new dimension to it. So I think it's always important to think of the people who are struggling at work. There's also at the bottom of that people who are actually off work due to ill health. But when you're considering what controls or processes you want to put in place for well-being, I think this works just as well in thinking there are some people who will be thriving, but we also have to have a lot of things in place because the majority of people will have various different struggles, whether it's family, whether it's COVID related, or whether it's health related or work. So that's a kind of overview in terms of the ongoing issues that we think are kind of there and the things that you could be doing in terms of getting people back to work and maintaining, keeping people in work. What I think we'd like to go on to is looking at the manager's role in that, and Louise Stewart's going to come in here. And Louise, if you want to just tell me when you want me to change the slides, I can do that.
So more than ever in this current climate, because of coronavirus, it's important that organisations revisit how they're supporting the mental health and wellbeing of their workforce, and line managers have been shown to have a critical role in this. So I want you all to have a little think about what you think makes a good manager and a bad manager. So on one extreme, a bad manager could be abusive, negative, inconsistent, and this could cause employees to experience issues in the workplace, including stress-related health problems. On the other hand of the scale, feeling valued and supported by a manager can help employees manage all types of difficulties, including managing health issues and conditions. That's obviously the type of manager that we're looking for. So what exactly is a manager's role in wellbeing? So we believe that to support wellbeing, a good manager should encourage, motivate and support employees, be able to communicate clearly and effectively, provide a safe, healthy working environment, provide regular support and supervision to employees, be able to give clear direction and leadership, ensure that employees know their roles and what's expected of them, and provide development options and opportunities for employees. So hopefully you agree with all that. But it's important to recognise that managers can't just do that all on their own without any support or guidance or training. Managers need training too. So for a manager to be able to encourage, foster and support wellbeing, they need to have the appropriate awareness and training in place to allow them to do this. So the next slide, please, Susan. So this is our mentally healthy workplace training. This is a screen grab from our virtual learning environment. So we know that training for line managers is important, and at Healthy Working Lives we offer free mentally healthy workplace training for line managers. We do this face to face. This has temporarily been paused at the moment due to COVID, and online through our virtual learning environment. So that's through our VLE. While our course was developed before COVID, the pandemic, it remains highly valuable at a time when understanding mental health and supporting positive mental health is so important. The training's aimed at line managers, but anyone can access it, so anyone, whether you're in work or not as well, to gain an understanding why workplaces have a role to play in supporting their staff. Another VLE virtual learning environment course that might be of use to you could be the a module by NEST, so National Education for Scotland, and it is free. It's an e-learning module. It's aimed at health and social care staff, which teaches the basic principles of psychological first aid. I'm just going to try and turn up my volume in this and see if you can hear me better. Could I have the next slide, please, Susan? So to support wellbeing in the workplace as a manager, you might need to have difficult conversations. You probably already have techniques that you would use to support a friend or family who's distressed or showing signs of being under pressure or struggling. At work, these same actions can be used. There are many simple things that we can all do to support someone who may be struggling with their mental health, such as ask the person if they're okay, show concern for their well-being, encourage them to talk about their problem or situation, listen actively and non-judgmentally, show you're willing to help, and encourage them to seek professional help or support. So next slide, please. And I'll talk about signposting and different resources a little bit later on in the presentation. So this is quite a nice guide and resource that you can use in the workplace. So it's been developed by Mind and CIPD, and it includes some questions that you can use to start a conversation with a team member who appears to be showing signs of being unwell. This can be used to shape a conversation. It shouldn't be used as a checklist. And I'm not going to read out the questions. I just wanted you to have it here in this presentation so that you could use it in practice a little bit later. That's me. Okay.
Right, technology, fast class here that I'm learning. So what we thought was also important, Louise has mentioned a little bit about training. And again, everything is different in a COVID world. And what I wanted to just mention briefly was we get a lot of requests at the moment about face-to-face training and getting that up and running. At the moment, as Louise says, in Public Health Scotland, we have suspended all face-to-face training, and I can talk about that in a little second. But in the first case, what I was going to say is I'm conscious a lot of you have people who are back working, you have people back in your workplace, and so delivering training in the workplace might seem just business as usual. So I suppose it was just to flag up that at the moment, if people are delivering training, our guidance is, yep, I mean, wellbeing and mental health are particular ones that people really want to be doing something in. And if you are going to do something face-to-face, which even sounds a wee bit sinister nowadays, but I think you just have to have a review of the conditions you'll be delivering training in terms of your location. Does it allow for spacing? Does it have good ventilation? Cleaning regimes, if people are sitting in different seats when they come back from lunch. We used to all love moving people around during training. Don't know if that's such an option now. Spacing, as I say, records before people come. Are you going to look and see whether people have health conditions that would mean that that was a more vulnerable place for them to be? But again, you may already have individual risk assessments for people and know that information. And also on the day, will you be asking people to clarify and confirm that they haven't got any temperatures and they're feeling well? And possibly, which is a contentious one, but looking at groups of people, we know some groupings of people, older people, different racial groups or whatever, are known to be more susceptible to COVID and more extreme reactions. So again, it opens a can of worms, but it is something you have to have a think about, whether you will restrict who can attend face-to-face training at the moment. In terms of alternatives, certainly at the moment, Public Health Scotland, we are it's online all the way, But I just, and I think that has a lot to learn, to bring to the table, in particular in relation to wellbeing, because sometimes people don't want to be as open, so can do a little bit of learning themselves. I do think though that it is not as simple as simply putting your training online. What you want to be thinking about is the way you deliver, the way you can interact with people, all of those things. Things like this, it's a little bit more stressful for your own staff wellbeing who are delivering it, so that's also something to think about. But what we're finding is that you can't cover as much online in a session as you would do face-to-face. So perhaps it is about breaking down your training and considering putting it into sort of bite-sized chunks and workshops, which are maybe more interactive, and you can tease out some issues then. In particular, what we would say, if you're looking at wellbeing, it's really important to make sure you consider, if somebody becomes distressed, how can you support them remotely? So again, remote training is the solution for a lot of things at the moment, but bear in mind that it does bring its own issues that you need to consider. Breakout rooms and things can work quite well if you have Teams or Zoom or whatever, but it just definitely needs considered. It's not an easy fix. There's a lot, as Louise says, of our training that's online and on the NES website, particularly in relation to COVID. So even having a look at what they have put up will give you an idea of what can be done. And an example of the sorts of things that are being used more at the moment by us are small animations, for example, which we run. This is the Astel animations, which were brought out in relation to suicide prevention. But what's been quite good is that we've produced facilitators notes for different scenarios. And so you could facilitate topics like this, which are very, you have to be very careful with, but also you can facilitate some work still. So it's not about forgetting to do the work or putting it completely on hold, but it's just about finding ways to do it in a safe way. This is a whistle-stop tour, right enough. But so I just also wanted to mention for mentally flourishing workplaces, in case people hadn't heard of it, what it essentially is it's based around the Thriving report that Thompson and Farmer brought out for mental health and wellbeing, and it was accepted by the Westminster government, and up in the Scottish government is keen for us to have something very Scottish in relation to it, and there is talk of bringing out some workplace mental health standards that would allow workplaces to benchmark themselves. It's been involving a lot of people working in mental health, like CME, but also including HSE who are doing the inspections and things, so that everybody has got something to say. And at the moment it's been slightly delayed because of COVID, but we are still pushing, and there is a commitment to a set of standards which I think will really help businesses and organisations to benchmark themselves and know that they are doing things well. We have a lot of tools that Louise is going to talk about in relation to everything that's going on, and we'll be about after this, so you can ask us more questions, because I'm very conscious we've just skimmed the surface.
Okay, so having a robust mental health signposting list is so important for any organisation to have, and we recommend that organisations think about what supports they've got both internally and externally, and communicate it. Make sure that your line managers know what's available to equip them to be able to support the employees that they support. You might have access to an employee assistance programme, occupational health, some counselling, physio, or some dedicated apps or websites if they're available. On our website at healthyworkandlife.scot, on our COVID section, we've actually got a list of so Scottish external resources that you can signpost to, and we've got the page that's dedicated to that. You can also go on Scottish Government Clear Your Head campaign, and they've also got a page of signposting tools and resources. It's not workplace specific, but obviously it's important for mental health and wellbeing, and they're available as well on the Clear Your Head website. So wellness action plans, they are a practical tool that can be used in the workplace to support the relationship between line managers and staff. All staff can develop their own plan regardless if they've got a diagnosed mental health condition or issue or not, and you can find them for free on the Mind website. So Susan had touched a little bit on risk assessments before, so on our website, I'm doing a lot of plugging off our website, we've got a free COVID-19 return to work toolkit. It includes an example of a stress risk assessment form for individuals and teams, and also the COVID-19 age risk assessment tool that was developed by ALMA, which Susan has discussed on before. It's available on the Scottish Government website, and it can help staff and managers consider the individual, the specific individual, and their specific risk to COVID-19 in the workplace on an individual basis. So you'll see on the slide there's other organisations and supports that you can add to your signposting list to make sure that your employees know who they can talk to. So we can provide all the different website links afterwards. You know, feel free just to ask for them. So you've got, of course, us at Healthy Working Life. So we have a free advice line that you can call Monday to Friday 9 to 5. We've also got a website that has also got a web chat service, and we've also got professionals from a range of backgrounds, including occupational health, mental health and wellbeing, and health and safety. So feel free to contact us with any issues or any queries or questions you might have. There's Working Health Services Scotland, which is available for businesses with under 250 employees, and that allows you to access different services such as counselling, physiotherapy, and in some areas occupational therapy. Promise is a website that is available for mental health and wellbeing. It's specifically for NHS, social care employees and unpaid carers during COVID. Lots of useful information that's available there, and they've also got a helpline that you can phone as well. Scottish Government Clear Your Head campaign, it's out, it's they're online. They've got lots of really user-friendly, really interesting tips, hints, suggestions about how to look after your mental health and wellbeing, specifically during COVID. And then other organisations and charities such as Mental Health Foundation, See Me, which is Scotland's anti-stigma and discrimination charity. They've got a See Me in Work programme as well that you could tap into in the workplace. Mind and NHS Informed. So that those are credible signposting that you can safely direct your employees to as well. I forgot to mention that there is different telephone helplines out there as well that you would be able to signpost yourself or employees to use. So you've got the Samaritans that are there 24 hours a day, and then you've got Breathing Space, which is a listening telephone service which has got specific opening hours. I'm not too sure exactly what they are, but they're longer at the weekend, and we can provide you with more specific details regarding that after. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks very much for that, Susan and Louise. All very helpful and informative, and there's a few questions arising from that I'll hopefully be able to put to you at the end of the session. But now we're going to move on to a contribution from Jason Fevers. So I'll hand over to Jason if you're ready, and I'll come back to you at the end of the session. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Richard. So what I wanted to sort of cover early is sort of thinking back to February, March time, when COVID was at a peak. You couldn't really avoid seeing media images of hospital wards overflowing, makeshift morgues being set up in car parks. It was a real sort of visual around the impact of COVID at that time. Even today, within workplaces and daily lives, you can't really help to see the impacts that coronavirus is continuing to have. So I'm thinking in terms of people walking around wearing face coverings, distance markings within shops and workplaces. So a very, very visual effect still of coronavirus. I think the psychological impact of coronavirus is perhaps a lot more hidden. And so that's really what I wanted to talk about today on there as well. So I'm really going to focus on three main things. The first of those is psychological first aid. So we're going to look at what that is, just a little bit of an introduction to that. Also looking at identifying high-risk individuals. So just got a little bit more detail around that as well. And then the final part is very much around self-care. A lot of you will probably be already familiar with 5 Ways to Wellbeing. I'll just do a little bit of an introduction to that, and also look at how we can apply that specifically around coronavirus as well. Okay, so if people are interested in doing a lot more sort of learning around psychological first aid, it's different from mental health first aid. So some of you might already have mental health first aid trainers in your workplaces. You may have done the training yourself for that. Whereas mental health first aid is very much aimed at how you can support individuals with concerns and issues, and identifying those sort of cases that come up. Psychological first aid is much more recognising where there's an impact across a much wider population. So it was developed more around disasters, relief work, that type of thing, but it has been adapted very much to apply to sort of pandemics, particularly around COVID as well. So there is an online course. It's about a 3-hour online learning, free of charge, that's been created by Public Health England. The link to that is on the slide there, and I'm sure Ben will be able to sort of share the link for that as well. And whereas for mental health first aid, they use an approach called ALGE, which you'll be familiar with if you've done the training, if not similar to what Louise talked through in her slides around an approach to talking to people and having those listening conversations with people about mental health as well. With psychological first aid, because it's much more at that population level, we know that it might be a much larger number of people affected at that same time. It takes a different approach, which is much more around identifying the people who need help, assessing what the support needs might be across a much more organisational level, and then ways of approaching safely and identifying further support needs. So it does vary in that approach from the more standard mental health first aid courses that are out there. And you sort of strongly recommend people having a look at that if they do want to know a little bit more about that. So the first stage of that is really around identifying people who may need help. That could be some really obvious examples, such as people who are in obvious distress, people who are actively approaching, seeking support for psychological needs. So yeah, that's sort of the easy ones to recognise. But a lot of the time, it's going to be much more hidden than that. So what you may come across in the workplace is people that are seeking support for other needs, but where you can recognise that there might be signs of psychological distress. So for example, they might come to talk to you about PPE, but they seem overly anxious or detached. They don't seem themselves. So it's just looking out for these little signs in your day-to-day interactions within the workplace, and that can really help to recognise if there is someone that is struggling with the mental health. Becoming withdrawn can certainly be a sign of worsening mental health, but that can often be a lot harder to spot, particularly during the current pandemic. So in the past, if there was someone that was always quite sociable, would sort of come along to workplace social events and things like that, and they suddenly stop going, it might raise alarm bells, thinking, is there something not quite right? In today's climate, it may well be that they're just avoiding social interaction because of risk of coronavirus. So things like that, which have been changed by the pandemic as well. And it can be very, very subtle cues. So the main thing really is just to be aware, to think about the potential of people being affected psychologically because of COVID, and looking out for those signs. And again, as I sort of touched on earlier, just asking people how they are, making time for that conversation can be really, really important for that as well. Moving on to identifying high-risk individuals. So Susan talked about the COVID age tool, which again, you sort of strongly recommend having a look at tools like that to really identify the high-risk individuals within your workplace. Some of the key things really comes down into groups that have been directly affected. So that might be people that have been infected or the relatives have been infected. Particularly if there's a bereavement, then as would always be the case with bereavement, there's a real risk there in terms of psychological psychological health, mental health. People that are at increased risk of severe illness with COVID as well. So we're talking about clinically vulnerable people, older people, people with underlying medical conditions, people of Black, Asian, minority ethnic origin. So there's those groups that we know are higher risk of actually the impact if they were to get coronavirus. So also it's thinking about the psychological impact it has on them as well, knowing that they're higher risk if something was to happen. Might also be people that are more vulnerable to secondary stressors. So that's much more about the impact of control measures, social distancing. So certainly people with pre-existing mental health conditions, if they're losing a lot of the support networks, the coping mechanisms, then there's much more increased risk of mental health conditions worsening or developing during the pandemic as well. Also people suffering from financial issues, employment, housing insecurity, people victims of domestic abuse, those type of things, you're all much more vulnerable to the psychological risks of coronavirus as well. Could also be a really important one here is people that are supporting other people. So that could be within workplace settings, could be within personal life as well. And certainly on a recent mental health first aid course, one of the participants shared their feelings about supporting a close relative who was expressing distress due to redundancy, social distancing, just sort of really struggling with the whole sort of changes because of the pandemic. But this individual was also in a position at work where they needed to support others, and they just felt that they weren't really getting much of a break from it, that they were sort of helping someone, supporting someone outside of the workplace, and then that was a key part of their role at work as well. So they felt that they were really starting to struggle with not getting that support, feeling that they were sort of having to sort of really sort of take on other people's sort of concerns and be there for other people rather than for themselves. So that's a really important one as well. In terms of assessing support needs, so the main elements really within the workplace is looking at what the practical support needs may be for that. So a lot of that will be around things like adhering to infection control measures, being able to access personal protective equipment. Some groups that may be requiring more support needs is people with caring responsibilities, so looking after children, the elderly, those with learning disabilities. There's a lot of changes going on in the workplace now where people who were working remotely are maybe now starting to come back into the workplace. Schools are going back, but is it on sort of limited capacity? Are people going to be off at short notice? That type of thing. So it's looking at that flexible working around that as well. And also things like advice or assistance with finances, housing, employment, education. So do you have signposting? Do you have EPAs available? That type of thing that you can make available to people. They're all sort of key points as well around support needs. We move on now a lot more to how we can support wellbeing. So a lot of this can be at an individual level, things that you can apply for yourself, but it's also something that you can share with other people as well. So if you're not familiar with 5 Ways to Wellbeing, basically it came out of a piece of work by the New Economics Foundation, commissioned by UK government to look at research into wellbeing and simple steps to promote improved wellbeing. They found really there were sort of 2 key parts to that. The first of those was about feeling good. So that's really about positive emotions such as happiness, contentment, enjoyment, curiosity, engagement, that type of thing. So these are generally very internal things, but it's also about functioning well. And that's really more about positive relationships, having some control over one's life, having a sense of purpose. So these are things that require more of an interaction with the outside world. A recent study found that only about 14% of the population, of the UK population, has a high level of well-being, being classed as flourishing. So even pre-pandemic, there's a lot that needs to be done to improve well-being. And then 5 Ways to Wellbeing, it really focuses on 5 key areas that people can introduce to improve well-being. So I'm just going to sort of quickly run through what those are. So connection. It's particularly important, and during this time of pandemic, it's quite challenging. The way that we connect with people has changed massively. But the key thing here really is that connection, it's not just about being around people, that you can be in a room, in an office with dozens of people and not particularly feel connected. You can just have a telephone conversation with someone and feel a great level of connection. So it's ways of improving that connection. And I think there's been some really good examples of that during COVID as well. So people writing postcards, sticking messages on windows, saying hello to friends and neighbours, showing support for key workers. There's been lots of really nice examples of how COVID has actually helped with connections, but then we know there's lots and lots of examples where people feel disconnected as a result of that as well. So again, a key one to be aware of. Being active. So we know during lockdown, it was restricted to groups of no more than 2 people from the same household being able to go out for a walk each day, or form of exercise. Certainly my experience was that there was a lot more people exercising than usual during the start of lockdown. So when I was at my sort of regular times, seeing lots more people out cycling, walking, running. As the restrictions started to get lifted and we could go out more often, I actually seem to see less and less people going out exercising. So it's been an interesting sort of psychological study there on behaviour change and the impact of scarcity. That, when we felt we could only go out once a day, we made sure we did. Now we can go out more frequently. People are sort of less feeling it's a priority to be able to do that. Been a big rise in online workouts, a great way to be motivated to keep active within the confines of the house. But also active commuting is quite an interesting one as well. That working from home means that people that were active commuting before may have a downturn in the amount of activity that they're doing. On the flip side, when people are travelling to a workplace, it may be that they're choosing to walk or cycle rather than to use public transport. So I think there's sort of different changes really around that as well. So being curious. So during COVID, I think a lot of people might have had more time to appreciate what's around us, to sort of connect with the local area. People may have started things like mindfulness, and having that awareness is a really important thing, a part of mental well-being. Another side of that is people are becoming more aware, more curious. There can be a downside to that as well, about worrying a lot more about the future and being more sort of aware of feelings. And I think the key thing there is having awareness, but taking the time to talk about how we're feeling, to share with others, to have that sort of open listening around that as well is really, really important. Next part of that is around keeping learning. So image of a sourdough loaf there. I think it's something that you sort of really took off during lockdown. A number of people doing home baking, learning new skills, taking up new interests, that type of thing. And again, that can be a really positive way of improving well-being. That it's a way of sort of shutting out the outside world, having a more sort of focus, more sense of flow. Can also give a real sense of achievement as well. So my own attempts at sourdough bread hasn't really led to that sense of achievement, but a lot of other learning where you're learning new things, making progress, it can be a really positive part as well. And a lot of the 5 ways link in with each other. So if you're doing some learning, it could also be a physical activity. So you're joining a dance class, something like that. It can be an opportunity to connect with others. An opportunity to be more aware of what we're doing, and certainly to do an activity but just sort of go through the motions without really engaging in it isn't going to be as impactful as where we're doing sort of lots of different parts of 5 ways at the same time. That's quite a key one. Final one, 5th element of 5 ways to wellbeing is about giving back, and that's something which is, again, there's been a lot of changes during COVID. I think there's some real positive examples of communities joining together to support each other, volunteering, people giving blood, donating plasma if they've been infected with coronavirus to be then used for others. Even just simple little things like showing support, the Thursday clap for the NHS, clap for carers, all those type of things. Just you sort of linking into people around, giving things back. And there's been a lot of research that's shown that it's so powerful, the benefits that you get from giving to other people. It has a real positive impact on your own mental well-being, as well as on the people who are at the receiving end of that giving. So it's really, really important to sort of be aware of that side of it as well. And then the final one I'm going to move on to is looking a lot more at how you can increase wellbeing in the workplace. So although 5 ways to wellbeing has been deliberately focused on things that individuals can do, so when the research was carried out for it, any interventions interventions that required organisational change, they're actually excluded from the study because it needed to be things that individuals could do for themselves. Having said that, I think that we really need to focus on wellbeing as being a collective, not an individual endeavour. And I think specifically within the workplace, I think it's really helpful just to take a bit of time just to think about what you can do in the workplace. Do you do things already that can increase wellbeing, or what else could you do, particularly in light of COVID and the changes that are happening there? So that was sort of my leaving sort of part on there, just to have a little bit of a think, just to sort of decide what your current offer is and how you may need to change that to take effect of coronavirus. And I'm going to pass back to Richard now.
Thanks very much indeed, Jason. That was very interesting, very helpful, and dare I say, motivational, even in part. So thank you very much for that. So now I would like to invite everybody to put their cameras back on, and we will have a look at some questions. If anybody has any thoughts or observations they would like to feed in, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There were one or two points which occurred to me during the course of the presentation, so I'd like to pick those up with Susan first. So just thinking about the training issues that we spoke about, or that you spoke about in your presentation, Susan. I don't know if the TURAS system was mentioned, but I think that's a purely Scottish platform.
Yeah.
But there is an awful lot of information on there, and if anybody is looking for some additional e-learning content that your current provider is not able to source for you, then I think they could probably do a lot worse than getting in touch with their local health board and trying to find out whether any of that is available.
Yeah, I think at the beginning of COVID, NES, which is the sort of overarching health education group for NHS staff, arranged to make a lot of their COVID-related material freely available to anybody, and so it does sit within TURAS. And you're right, one of the easiest ways to go on to it is to just go on to NES, and I think it's nes.org, somebody will correct me if it's different, but if you just have a look on that, I'm pretty sure the last time I was on it there was a direction straight away to COVID related materials. There's a lot of information there in relation to managing and things like that as well, but that then in turn takes you through, as far as I'm aware, straight into various different resources that sit within TURAS. You're right as well, though, that TURAS can be used by people outside of NHS, which was a revelation to me about 6 months ago. But some companies don't like to use it because obviously they already have their own recording processes. But you're right. Anyone can set up it's just a platform really. So anybody can set up a sort of registration and an account on it. But sometimes going via NES, who are actually the people that put the things on TURAS, can help you track down things easier. So definitely.
Right. Thanks very much for that. I know we have our own LMS. I can't remember what it stands for, but that's where all our e-learning is recorded. So it can be difficult to try and bring something alongside that, but it's certainly worth looking into.
Yeah. A lot of the things, I was just going to say, a lot of the things have certificates that if you really wanted people to access them. So I'm thinking even of a lot of the learning that's on the e-library that we have in Public Health Scotland, they get a certificate. So sometimes I know companies will get people to complete it and then print off the certificate to show as part of their PDP for their learning with their own organisation outside of the NHS. And sometimes, although they're doing it less and less, for example, with our mentally healthy workplace training, if we have trainers working in organisations, then the organisation can actually host the online learning themselves within their own packages. So that makes it much easier to record who's right. Completed it.
Okay. One other thing that occurred to me while you were delivering your content about training was, have you seen any really effective tools for capturing evidence of learning and translating into practice, translating the comprehension checks and that sort of thing into actual practice in the workplace?
I think you're right. I think that's the holy grail, isn't it? To prove that your learning has impacted, isn't it? And it's quite hard in wellbeing, I think, because actually it's like all public health. When things don't go wrong, nobody notices how much you did to stop that happening. I suppose it's like all health and safety, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it does come down a lot to the manager's training, and you can then see the impact of that, because what we do see is that managers' behaviours change in relation to one-to-ones and meetings, where you can see there's a real shift in the way people speak to each other, or you hope for. And you also see things being flagged up more regularly. So for example, you'll start seeing managers feeding more people into occupational health, or flagging up in the reasons why they're being more flexible with working hours, because they're recognising the impact that allowing someone to maybe be more flexible with their working time because of situations that are affecting their well-being, they're actually keeping those people working, which is actually good for them. It gives them structure while other stuff might be going on and their home life may be quite chaotic. So I think it's more practical things that you see it in terms of learning, and ultimately I suppose you start seeing maybe less absence or shorter absence, because people are more supported to come back into work more quickly, because the managers are understanding the importance of well-being and good mental health in their staff. So things are getting dealt with quicker, and maybe they are being told, do you know what, that sounds really hard at the moment, take a week and then come back in, rather than them struggling and not managing and not opening up, and then things deteriorating and someone's off for 6 months. So that was a very long answer, but I think like everything with, especially around well-being, is so individual that the more you see it as in the bottom line around communication improving and monitoring your absence or your uptake of occupational health and supports that way, that's probably the best way to see if you're making an impact. Oh, you're silent. Oh,
Sorry.
it's okay.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, there's a question coming for Jason from the audience. Are you able to? Thanks, Jason. Do you want to have a word?
Okay, yeah. So which was the question, Richard?
We've had a question in from Gary about changes to lifestyles and activities before and after the lockdown. He's talking about routine, and when I was listening to your content, I was thinking about whether or not some of the things that people are actually experiencing now were as a result of pre-existing problems that were already there before COVID actually came along and revealed them by putting some stress on the system. So we all have habits and routines and little rituals at the beginning and the end of every day, and those are obviously gaining increasing importance as our environment changes, our working environment. So have you seen any particularly good examples of ways to form habits and particular types of habits that would perhaps support people in their well-being while working from home or just through a period of change?
Right, yeah, so habit formation is extremely important, that by having sort of a specific cue. So it might be that we go and do exercise at a certain time of the day. Might be recognising additional support that we need. So people doing the PE with Joe Wicks when that was on, really, really good sort of habit forming. So there's been some great examples that have come out as a result of COVID. I think part of the challenges are where, because of the changes that have happened, everyone's out of routine. So it might be that people had well-established habits that helped them to maintain mental health previously, whereas because of COVID, they're having to think of new ways of doing that. So the idea with motivation is it's much more efficient if we can have that sort of autonomic, sort of way of doing things, the habitual side of things, but it's being aware that sometimes we do need to be more reflective and find other ways of creating habits if something's happened that stops those old habits continuing. So I think it's a really good question, and yeah, definitely things that we need to do to be aware of that and to sort of foster new habits where appropriate.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the keeping active side of things, and I now experience sourdough anxiety and Joe Wick's guilt thanks to lockdown. So those are two new experiences for me that I'm having to, internalize and deal with.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing where it's doing external activities, but it's being aware of the impact it's having internally as well. And you're thinking that if your sourdough doesn't work, you put it down as a learning experience, and you know what to do differently next time.
Grow as a person, even if your sourdough doesn't.
Yeah.
There's been a comment just come through in the chat about breaks, regular breaks actually being essential. It's the easiest thing to do, perhaps the most difficult thing to get into the habit of doing, because you tend to focus on work a little bit more consistently when you're working in your own environment and there's nobody else around. However, the importance of breaks. And there were a number of other questions that I had for both presentations about things like the working environment as it was, whether or not offices are now redundant or obsolete, for example, whether your individual risk assessment is a good trigger for psychological first aid, which it obviously is. And I was also hoping to touch on the remobilisation guidance which Public Health England have published, which came out and is now in force as of Monday. So there's a lot of information in there about infection control, but also it does talk about individual risk assessments and how those could be built into the workplace. So there are no other questions coming through on the Q&A. And if anybody has any final closing points they'd like to make, there's a feedback form just popped up on your screen from Ben. I'll open the floor up to our presenters again just before we finish to see if there's anything they would like to add.
I was wondering if I could just pick up on the thing around regular breaks there. I think if I work most of the time remotely now, well, all of the time at the moment remotely, and I used to be quite famous for lamenting the loss of the inbox on my desk, which if it had had 30 letters in it when I came in the morning, no one would have expected me to do anything else. Whereas now 100 emails, or in those days 100 emails in your email you were expected to deal with. The working from home has been a new revelation that not only do you now have emails coming in, you have Teams and people messaging constantly, and so there's now another layer, and it's something we were already picking up on with the mentally flourishing workplace standards, this whole electronic way of working. I think it is something we need to be aware of in terms of stress and pressures on people, because essentially you can have 4 or 5 people messaging straight away in Teams, and people, whereas email people expecting an instant response, Teams is a whole new level. If they see your green light, you are fair pickings. And I think as a manager, it's something we need to be aware of in the first instance, and perhaps think how we manage that. I don't have solutions yet, I'm afraid to say, but I'm finding some myself, but even the red light doesn't stop it. But whereas if we were in the office, if someone was already speaking to you, you wouldn't have other people coming up and interrupting. And so I think it's a sort of anecdotal thought in terms of, I think it's something we need to be aware of. Breaks are harder to find now. And I think there's been some research done around people's perception of, or their own guilt, that they're not working as hard as their colleagues as well, which is an issue to be aware of again, that they perhaps need to address in conversations. But it was just my thoughts when you were talking there, and I thought, my email complaint has now moved to a new level with Teams as well, and I still have the emails. But I think it's an interesting one, and I think moving to remote working has brought it's got some benefits that are amazing, and I'm not commuting for 2 hours, but I do think that there's other issues that we need to bear in
I
mind.
think it just highlights the importance, Susan, doesn't it, of work-life balance? You know, and maybe even more so now that we, you know, a larger proportion of staff are working from home, and about scheduling in respite time away from work. And I know that lots of holidays and opportunities to use your annual leave are different or are non-existent, but still making sure that you're scheduling in time to have that downtime for respite, to spend with your loved ones, your family, or to spend time doing meaningful stuff on your own. And making sure that, I suppose, remote working has opened up opportunities for some people to engage in work that works for them, which might be working different hours of the day, but that might not also suit the rest of the team members. So like what you said, it can sometimes add that little element of pressure as well, you know, or you've got an email that's coming in maybe at 11 o'clock at night, and you come on and you sign in at 9 o'clock. So you're maybe, as an employee, you think, should I be doing that as well? But it's just about, I suppose, communication with your line manager, working the hours that you're supposed to, communicating any sort of issues that's coming up as well, and making sure that during the day you're trying to get away from wherever your working space is and getting out and getting some fresh air, getting some sunlight, possibly getting some light exercise, and trying to incorporate that, you know, to your daily working life as well, because lots of us are missing out on our commute, and that would involve either walking or cycling, or, you know, going to a train station and then, you know, getting on the train, and that there's that full routine element that's been lost. So I've heard that people sometimes go out their house and do a lap of their block, and that's their walk to work, and then they come and sit down, and then that starts their day. So whatever works for you, it's an individualized approach as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Jason, a brief comment to end with, Jason, because that's us on time.
Right, yes, just really picking up on some of the comments around sort of changes to offices become obsolete, the impacts of COVID on mental health when people were struggling with mental health previously, that type of thing. And I think a big part that it's really sort of amplified things, that a lot of things that were there sort of bubbling under the surface beforehand are now a lot more apparent. So I think there should be some real positives in terms of how we address these things, but it's looking at how you would do that. You're sort of really taking the positives out of the situation, both in terms of the internal side, to supporting people, positive emotions, how they feel about what's going on, listening, talking to people, as well as the external side in terms of how we change the workplace. Do we allow more working from home, even when things have returned more to normal after the pandemic, that type of thing. So I think there's some really interesting sort of questions and some really interesting sort of things to be looking at over the next few months and beyond.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So the information that we had at the start of the presentation about the slides being available after today still stands. There'll be an email circulated afterwards with all the information that we've put forward on the slide and so forth. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to our presenters today. Thank you very much to IOSH and Ben in particular for providing the support to keep us going. And thank you all very much indeed for coming along and watching and listening today. I hope you found it helpful. And please do tune into any future IOSH webinars. We hopefully will put some more forward from the Health and Social Care Group, but there's a whole list of webinars that you can make use of on the IOSH website, going all the way back to earlier on in the year, specifically on the subject of COVID, but on a range of other topics as well. So that concludes our broadcast for today. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.